I knew something was off the moment I saw the construction crew in my backyard. At first, I thought they had the wrong house. But no, they were right where they wanted to be on my property, pouring concrete like they owned the place. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, stomping across my lawn. One of the workers, a guy in an orange vest, barely looked up. "Sorry, sir, we're just following the plans we were given." "Plans?" My voice was sharp. "Whose plans?" That's when I heard the voice I had come to despise. Sharon Whitmore, president of the HOA. Middle-aged, always in a pastel blazer, and somehow always carrying a clipboard like she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a suburban neighborhood. "Ah, Xavier," she said, her tone dripping with fake concern. "I was hoping to catch you before you got home." I folded my arms. "You got about 10 seconds to explain why there's a construction crew on my property." She let out a breathy little laugh like I was being unreasonable. "Now, let's not be hasty. This is all just a misunderstanding." I gestured to the freshly poured concrete. "A misunderstanding? You're building something in my backyard without my permission." Sharon gave me that condescending look she saved for homeowners who dared to question her authority. "Well, technically, it's not for you, it's for Karen." Karen. Of course. Karen Mullins, former PTA tyrant turned HOA's favorite busybody. She had a habit of treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and apparently she had decided my backyard was her next conquest. I turned my glare on Sharon. "Karen built a patio on my property," Sharon sighed as if I was being unreasonable. "It's just a small extension. She needed more space for entertaining, and your yard was, well, underutilized." I blinked. "Underutilized? She offered to maintain it, of course," Sharon continued as if that made it better. "And it improves property values, so really this benefits everyone." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Let me get this straight. She built a patio on my land without asking me, and you think that's fine because she'll maintain it." Sharon gave me a tight-lipped smile. "It's already done, Xavier. Tearing it up would be a waste of resources." I stared at her, my fists clenching. "You and Karen are going to regret this." Her smile faltered for a second before her usual smugness returned. "Oh, Xavier, the HOA has full authority over exterior modifications. You should really read the bylaws. This is a closed matter." I stared at the wet concrete. No way in hell was I letting this slide. If Sharon thought she could strong-arm me into accepting this, she was dead wrong. She just made the biggest mistake of her HOA career. I didn't waste any time. I took photos of the construction site from every angle, making sure to capture the foundation, the materials, and the exact location of the encroaching patio. If the HOA thought they could steamroll me, they were about to get a rude awakening. My first stop was City Hall. I walked into the Zoning and Property Records office, where an overworked clerk sat behind a desk stacked with paperwork. I gave him a polite nod and slid my property documents across the counter. "I need to confirm something," I said. "Has there been any zoning adjustment or permit issued for construction on my property?" The clerk adjusted his glasses and tapped at his keyboard. A few moments later, he frowned. "There's nothing here," he said. "No approvals, no permits, nothing." Exactly what I expected. "If someone built a structure on my land without permits, what are the penalties?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. The clerk glanced up, suddenly more interested. "That depends. If it's a minor encroachment, the city might just order a teardown. If it's a significant violation, especially if it involved deception or an HOA overreach, there could be fines and legal consequences." I nodded, my mind already racing ahead. "And what if they filed fraudulent paperwork to justify the build?" The clerk's frown deepened. "That would be serious. If they falsified documents, they could be facing criminal charges." That was all I needed to hear. I thanked him and left, dialing a number as I stepped outside. I had a friend, Marcus, who worked in real estate law. If anyone knew how to tear this apart legally, it was him. When he picked up, I got straight to the point. "Marcus, I need your expertise. My HOA let someone build on my property without permission. I need to shut it down fast." There was a pause before Marcus let out a low whistle. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. Did they file paperwork? No permits, no approvals, and I have a strong suspicion they faked something to justify it. Marcus was already on it. Send me everything you have. I'll pull records and see if they tried anything shady. If they falsified documents, we're talking fraud charges. That was music to my ears. By the time I got home, I had already put a plan in motion, but I wasn't stopping at just legal action. I wanted to make sure every single homeowner in the neighborhood saw exactly what Sharon and Karen were up to. The next morning, I printed out copies of my property deed along with photos of the illegal construction. Then, I went door to door. Most of my neighbors were decent people, tired of the HOA's overreach but too intimidated to fight back. When I showed them the evidence, their reactions ranged from shock to outright anger. "This is unbelievable," said Mrs. Thompson, who had been fined last year for having a garden gnome the HOA deemed unsightly. "If they can do this to you, what's stopping them from doing it to the rest of us?" That was exactly my point. Momentum was building. By the end of the day, I had over 30 signatures on a petition demanding an emergency HOA meeting. The board couldn't ignore that, especially not when homeowners were already threatening to withhold dues over the scandal. I knew Sharon wouldn't go down without a fight, but I was ready. The emergency meeting was held in the community center. The room was packed with homeowners spilling out into the hallway. Sharon sat at the front, her usual confident demeanor slightly strained. I stood and addressed the crowd. "I have proof that this HOA allowed construction on private property without permission or legal permits. This isn't just an overreach, it's illegal." Murmurs ran through the room. Sharon tried to interject, but I wasn't finished. "I've spoken to a real estate attorney and we're investigating whether fraudulent documents were filed. If that's the case, criminal charges aren't off the table." That got everyone's attention. Even Sharon paled slightly. Then I dropped the final bombshell. "And the city has already been informed. If they determine a violation, fines will be issued not against me but against the HOA and the responsible parties." The room erupted. Homeowners were furious, demanding answers. Sharon tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. That night, I got an email from Marcus. He had found an unauthorized amendment to the HOA records, attempting to claim a portion of my yard as common property. The problem? The amendment was never legally filed with the county. It was falsified. And now, I had everything I needed to bring the hammer down. Sharon's face had gone rigid as the homeowners around her erupted in outrage. The petition I had circulated had already put pressure on the HOA, but now, with Marcus uncovering the falsified amendment, this was no longer just a case of overreach. It was fraud, and the consequences were about to be severe. I took my time letting the crowd settle before speaking again. Every second made Sharon more uncomfortable, and I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done. "The document that attempted to claim my yard as common property," I began, my voice steady but firm, "it was never legally filed with the county. That means whoever submitted it knowingly misrepresented the HOA's authority, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is fraud." A murmur spread through the room. Some homeowners leaned forward, others exchanged glances, but all eyes were locked onto Sharon. She straightened, gripping her clipboard as though it could shield her from the storm that was coming. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions," she said, her voice strained but still trying to maintain control. "There must be a misunderstanding. Perhaps a clerical error." Marcus had prepared me well. I reached into my folder and pulled out a printed copy of the fraudulent amendment. "This isn't a clerical error. Someone in the HOA tried to slip this through without following legal procedure, and they got caught. The city is already aware, and an investigation is underway." That was when Karen, who had been sitting silently near the front, finally spoke. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, crossing her arms. "The patio is already built, and it's not hurting anyone. You're blowing this way out of proportion." I turned my attention to her, leveling my gaze. You had no right to build on my land. You didn't ask, you didn't negotiate, and you sure as hell didn't get legal approval. That's called trespassing and destruction of private property. She scoffed. Oh, please. It's a patio, not an apartment complex, and it looks better than whatever mess you had back there before. The entitlement in her voice was staggering, but I wasn't here to argue petty opinions. I was here to dismantle their entire scheme. I spoke with the city, I continued, ignoring her attempt to downplay the situation. They confirmed that since this was done without a permit, it's an unapproved structure. That means fines will be issued and the patio will be demolished at the expense of those responsible. That got Karen's attention. Her smugness wavered, replaced by something almost like panic. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, I said. And since fraudulent documents were involved, it's not just a matter of tearing down the patio. We're talking about potential criminal charges. Sharon's expression tightened. She knew I wasn't bluffing. The room had gone eerily quiet, everyone waiting to see how this would unfold. Then one of the homeowners, Mr. Patel, spoke up. If the HOA is involved in fraud, then we need to call for an audit. Who knows what else they've been doing behind our backs? More voices chimed in, agreeing. Sharon's composure finally cracked. There's no need for an audit, she said quickly. Everything is accounted for. I let out a short laugh. You'll forgive us if we don't take your word for it. The pressure was mounting, and I could see the wheels turning in Sharon's head. She was trying to figure out an escape, but there wasn't one. Then the final blow came. Marcus had been working behind the scenes, and earlier that day, he had filed an official complaint with the state's housing authority. Just as I was about to reveal this, my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus: city officials are moving forward. They're sending a cease and desist for all HOA activities until the investigation is complete. Perfect timing. I looked back up at Sharon. You might want to check your emails, I said. Because as of now, the HOA is under official investigation. That means no new fines, no enforcement of rules, and certainly no fraudulent land grabs until this is resolved. Sharon snatched her phone from the table, her face draining of color. Karen, still in denial, scoffed again. This is absurd. You can't just shut down the HOA, I shrugged. I didn't, the government did. The room erupted once again, this time with homeowners cheering. Some were already talking about pushing for a full board replacement. Others were demanding Sharon resign immediately. I turned to Karen one last time. You might want to start saving up, that patio. It's coming down, and if the city finds you responsible, you'll be paying for every bit of the demolition. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she slumped back in her chair, realizing that she had lost. As for Sharon, she grabbed her clipboard and stormed out of the room, but it was too late. Her hold over the neighborhood was gone, and with the HOA out of commission, it was only a matter of time before the entire corrupt system they had built came crashing down. The next morning, I was up early, sipping coffee on my porch when I noticed a city inspector stepping out of his truck. He was a stocky man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense expression, the kind of guy who had seen every shady homeowner scheme imaginable. He adjusted his hat and made his way toward me. Xavier Carter, he asked, flipping through a stack of documents. I nodded. That's me. You here for the patio? Sure am, he said, glancing over my shoulder at the monstrosity Karen had built. We got the complaint and the flagged paperwork. This is already a mess, and I haven't even stepped foot in the yard yet. I led him around back, where the concrete had fully set overnight. Karen must have thought she had won, that I'd just roll over and accept it, but the inspector's scowl told me otherwise. He crouched down, tapping at the surface with the end of his pen. Whoever did this didn't even bother with rebar in some sections, he muttered. Shoddy work. Wouldn't last 5 years before cracking. Not that it would be standing that long. He took several pictures, making notes as he walked the perimeter. Then he turned to me. She has no legal claim to this land, and there's no permit on record. This whole thing is in violation of at least 4 city codes. And if the HOA tried to manipulate zoning records, that's a whole different beast. I didn't need to hear more to know that Karen was finished. As the inspector worked, I heard a door slam from the house next door. Karen stormed into the yard, her face set in a scowl. She stopped short when she saw the inspector, her eyes darting to his clipboard. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The inspector didn't even look up. "Documenting an illegal structure," Karen scoffed. "This is ridiculous. That patio is on common property." "The HOA approved it." The inspector finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over private land, and even if they did, they'd still need city approval. You have neither." She folded her arms. "You can't just tear it down." The inspector arched a brow. "Actually, I can, and I will. You'll receive an official tear-down notice by the end of the day. If you don't remove it yourself, the city will do it and send you the bill." For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. She glanced at me, eyes narrowing. "You did this," I shrugged. "No, you did this. I just made sure the right people saw it." The inspector didn't wait for further argument. He snapped a few more pictures and made a notation before walking back toward his truck. "Expect an official citation within 24 hours, he said over his shoulder. Karen stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the right words. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed back into her house. I exhaled, satisfied, but I wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, I met with Marcus again. He had spent the last 24 hours digging through public records, looking for any signs of additional fraud. He slid a folder across the table. "I found something worse than just the forged amendment." I flipped it open, scanning the highlighted sections. It didn't take long for my stomach to tighten. Sharon and a few HOA board members had been misappropriating funds for years. They had been collecting special assessments from homeowners for supposed community improvements, but the money had mysteriously vanished. Some of it had been funneled into personal accounts. I let out a low whistle. "This isn't just HOA corruption, this is embezzlement." Marcus nodded. "And with the fraudulent land grab, they've crossed into federal territory, wire fraud, forgery, and misuse of funds. It's enough to bury them." The weight of it sank in. This wasn't just about my backyard anymore. Sharon and her cronies had been bleeding the neighborhood dry, using their power to line their pockets, and now they were about to face the consequences. I made sure the information got into the right hands: the city's fraud division, the state's housing authority, even the county prosecutor's office. It didn't take long for the hammer to drop. 3 days later, unmarked cars pulled up to Sharon's house. Plainclothes investigators stepped out, knocking on her door. She answered with her usual smug expression, but it evaporated when they flashed their credentials. Within minutes, they were inside, seizing documents and computers. Word spread like wildfire. The HOA board was in shambles. 2 other board members resigned on the spot, trying to distance themselves from Sharon's mess. But it was too late. Karen, meanwhile, had her own problems. The city had issued her a hefty fine for the illegal patio, and when she tried to fight it, they threatened to take her to court. She had no choice but to pay up and start demolition herself. I stood by my fence, watching as workers jackhammered the concrete she had been so proud of. She was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding inside. Good. By the end of the week, the patio was gone. My yard was mine again, and Sharon. She was facing charges that would ensure she never held power in a neighborhood again. The HOA, once feared, was now a joke. And without their grip tightening around everyone's throats, the neighborhood finally felt like a community again. Justice had been served. And I had a feeling Sharon and Karen would be feeling the consequences for a long, long time. With Sharon and her corrupt board members under investigation, the neighborhood was in a state of upheaval. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak out were now openly discussing the years of abuses they had endured. Stories of arbitrary fines, unexplained fees, and selective enforcement of rules spread like wildfire. I had barely stepped outside that morning when a group of neighbors gathered near my driveway, their voices carrying the kind of energy that only came from long-awaited justice. Mr. Patel, always the practical one, adjusted his glasses and shook his head. I knew something was off when they kept charging us for community improvements that never happened. Now it all makes sense. Beside him, Mrs. Thompson crossed her arms. Do you remember when they said they were upgrading the clubhouse security system? They charged every homeowner a special fee, but nothing ever changed. The realization hit harder than I expected. That money didn't go into security, it went straight into their pockets. Others nodded, each recalling their own experiences with Sharon's manipulation. Then a voice cut through the murmurs. They're going to pay for this. I turned to see Daniel, a retired police officer who had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades. His eyes were sharp, his stance firm. If there was anyone who could spot corruption from a mile away, it was him. They thought no one would put up a fight, I said. They wanted everyone too scared to push back. Daniel nodded slowly. They miscalculated. The conversation shifted as more neighbors arrived, eager to discuss next steps. With Sharon out of commission, the HOA was leaderless, and the homeowners had a choice: either dissolve the association entirely or replace it with something better. I say we get rid of it, said a younger man, Thomas, who had recently moved in. We've seen what happens when people like Sharon get too much power. Mrs. Thompson, ever the voice of reason, tapped her chin thoughtfully. If we do that, what happens to shared spaces? The pool, the park? Daniel exhaled. We need to reorganize. Get honest people in charge, people who actually care about the neighborhood. The discussion continued, but my focus shifted when I spotted movement from the house next door. Karen stood at her window, peering out with an expression caught between anger and disbelief. Her workers had already removed most of the illegal patio, leaving a torn-up section of land where fresh concrete had once stood. She had fought the order, of course she had, but there was no way around it. The city had been clear. The structure was illegal, and she was responsible. I met her gaze for a brief moment before she yanked the curtain shut. Daniel followed my line of sight and chuckled. She's not taking this well. She thought she could get away with it, I said. Now she's realizing that actions have consequences. The conversation eventually shifted to logistics, what the next HOA meeting would look like, who would step up to take leadership, and how to prevent future corruption. But as the neighbors talked, I kept an eye on Karen's house. Something told me she wasn't done causing trouble. By late afternoon, I was proven right. A loud knock rattled my door. When I opened it, Karen stood on my porch, arms crossed, her face set in a scowl. "This is your fault," she snapped. I leaned against the doorframe. "You built on my land. What exactly did you think would happen?" she scoffed. "I was trying to improve the neighborhood. You're the one who turned this into a circus." I arched a brow. "By stopping you from stealing my property," her nostrils flared. "You could have worked with me. Instead, you made a scene. Now the whole neighborhood is turned against me." I almost laughed. "You did that yourself." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You don't know who you're dealing with." For the first time, I saw something behind her anger, desperation. "You don't know who you're dealing with," I countered, "and you're running out of options." Her jaw clenched. "You think this is over?" I tilted my head. "You're being investigated, you've been fined, your illegal patio is gone." "What exactly do you think comes next?" She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Without another word, she turned and stalked back to her house, slamming the door behind her. I exhaled, shaking my head. She was grasping at straws. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had made its decision. A special election was held, and a new board was formed, one made up of homeowners who had been vocal about transparency and fairness. Sharon, meanwhile, had bigger problems. State investigators had frozen her assets, pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. And as more financial records surfaced, it became clear that this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a full-blown criminal case. The final nail in the coffin came when Marcus called me with an update. They found evidence of wire fraud, he said. Sharon and a few others were rerouting funds through fake vendors. It's not just local charges anymore, the feds are involved. My eyebrows lifted. She's going to prison. Most likely, Marcus confirmed. They don't play around with financial crimes. The news spread quickly, and by the time federal agents arrived at her house, no one was surprised. Homeowners stood on their porches, watching as Sharon was escorted out in handcuffs, her face pale and drawn. Karen, however, wasn't arrested. She hadn't been involved in the financial crimes, just the illegal construction. But she had lost all credibility, and with Sharon gone, she had no allies left. A for sale sign appeared in her yard a week later. The neighborhood had been through a storm, but we had come out stronger. And as I stood in my reclaimed backyard, watching the last of Karen's patio debris hauled away, I knew one thing for certain. This was a victory for homeowners who refused to be bullied, a victory for justice. And most of all, a victory that ensured no one would ever try to steal from this neighborhood again. With Sharon gone and Karen packing up to leave, the neighborhood was finally breathing easier. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid of ridiculous fines or shady HOA schemes. The special election had installed a new board, and the first order of business was restoring trust. But while most of the community had moved on, I wasn't done yet. There was still one loose end: the final legal proceedings against Sharon and her accomplices. Marcus kept me updated as the case unfolded. Investigators had uncovered additional financial discrepancies, including bogus invoices and fabricated maintenance costs that had siphoned money out of the HOA's reserve funds. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and the prosecution wasn't pulling any punches. One afternoon, I got a call from Marcus as I was clearing debris from my yard. Sharon had officially been indicted. I leaned against my fence, listening as Marcus detailed the charges. Wire fraud, embezzlement, falsification of legal documents, each count stacking up like bricks in a wall she'd never climb over. The HOA's former treasurer had taken a plea deal, spilling every detail of their operation in exchange for a lighter sentence. Sharon, however, was still in denial. She had hired a lawyer, but they weren't working miracles. The evidence was too overwhelming, and with the homeowners testifying against her, she had no chance of walking away unscathed. Marcus wrapped up the call with a final piece of news: the trial date was set. I knew I wouldn't miss it for anything. The courtroom was packed when the day arrived. Homeowners filled the seats, some whispering among themselves, others watching in silence as Sharon entered in a stiff blazer, her face pale but composed. The judge wasted no time laying out the charges before turning things over to the prosecution. The evidence was brutal. Bank statements showed the money trail, leading directly to Sharon's personal accounts. Emails revealed discussions about fabricating expenses to justify withdrawals. Even the fraudulent property amendment, the very thing that had led to the HOA's downfall, was presented as proof of her willingness to lie for personal gain. When the homeowners testified, the weight of their words settled over the room like a storm cloud. People who had been financially strained by Sharon's corruption spoke of unexpected fees, sudden dues increases, and threats for questioning the board's decisions. Then came the recordings. A former board member had secretly recorded a meeting where Sharon and her closest allies discussed covering their tracks. Their voices played over the courtroom speakers, cold and calculating as they plotted how to manipulate records without raising suspicion. It was the final nail in the coffin. Sharon's lawyer tried to argue that she had been misled by others, claiming ignorance of the worst offenses, but the jury wasn't buying it. By the end of the trial, the verdict came swiftly: guilty on all counts. The sentence was severe. With multiple felony convictions, Sharon was facing real prison time, not just fines or probation. The judge made it clear that her abuse of power and the financial harm she had caused warranted a strong sentence. The courtroom erupted with murmurs as she was led away, her expression blank. Outside, the homeowners gathered, the weight of years of corruption finally lifted. Conversations turned to the future, to rebuilding trust, to ensuring nothing like this ever happened again. As I walked back to my car, Marcus caught up to me, his expression satisfied. "It's over," he said. I nodded. For her, yeah, but the neighborhood still has work to do. And we did. With Sharon gone, the HOA was no longer a weapon against the homeowners but a tool for the community. Policies were rewritten, financial transparency became mandatory, and any future board members would be held accountable. The fear that had once gripped the neighborhood had been replaced with something else: determination. And as for Karen, her house sold within weeks. She left without a word, her reputation in ruins. No one missed her. Standing in my now empty backyard, I let out a breath. Justice had been served and the neighborhood was finally free.